Welcome to the UW Now Live. Tonight, we're discussing the growing rivalry between the U.S. and China and the related nuclear risks. Our panelists are experts in international relations and nuclear engineering. Sébastien Philippe is an assistant professor of nuclear engineering and engineering physics and associate faculty member in the La Follette School of Public Affairs. He was also recently awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, also known as a Genius Grant. Jessica Weeks is a professor of political science and the H. Douglas Weaver Chair in Diplomacy and International Relations. She is an expert in the domestic politics of international conflict. Our conversation will be moderated by your host, Mike Knetter.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. Tonight we are diving into a pressing issue shaping global politics: the growing rivalry between the United States and China. From disputes in the South China Sea to threats to Taiwan's independence and the race for dominance in artificial intelligence, tensions are rising and the stakes couldn't be higher. As highlighted in a Wall Street Journal feature this week, the conversation has gone nuclear, with discussion of both the nation's capabilities and potential testing on the table. So what does this all mean for global security? We'll explore some of the biggest questions with our experts tonight, such as what is the rationale for the U.S. to restart nuclear weapons testing, and how might China and other nuclear powers, most notably Russia, respond to that? What scenarios could lead to a military clash between the U.S. and China? And how can nuclear escalation be avoided? Is there a viable path forward for diplomatic engagement and arms control between the US and China and Russia as well? So help yourself to your favorite beverage. Feel free to put your own questions into our chat for our guests, and let's get started. Leading us off tonight is a repeat guest, Jessica Weeks, just introduced. She's a political scientist and an expert in international diplomacy. She also studies personalized dictatorships in her research. So I would imagine, Jessica, your business is booming right now. And we are really grateful that you took some time out to share your thoughts with our audience on this important topic. The platform is yours.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here in such great company. So I'm going to talk about the general risks of military escalation between the US and China. And then I think Sébastien will dive deeper into the nuclear aspect. So obviously the US and China have many areas of disagreement: trade, export controls, military competition, ideology, industrial espionage, the South China Sea, the list goes on. But the issue that seems most likely to lead to a military clash is this issue of Taiwan, as Mike mentioned. So many of you are probably familiar with the basics, so I'm just going to raise a few key points of background. So China has claimed Taiwan, this island off the coast of mainland China, since 1949. But Taiwan currently essentially functions as an independent country, and it's governed by a democratic government and has no interest, its population nor its government has no interest in what China calls reunifying with China. So there are many reasons that China and the US disagree about the status of Taiwan. There's very important global trade flows that go through the Taiwan Strait. There's the potential strategic location of Taiwan along the so-called First Island chain, where the US has many important alliances. But above all, Taiwan is a matter of national pride for China. And I think it's very important to understand that every child in China learns that Taiwan is a sacred part of China's territory. It's part of China's national identity. And also China feels as a great power that it shouldn't have this big island right off its coast that's aligned with foreign powers that it sees as its competitors, and perhaps even as unfriendly to it. So since 1979, there's been this very complicated status quo where the US officially recognizes that there's only, quote, one China, but it doesn't formally agree to China's claim over Taiwan's territory. And in fact, the US gives military support to Taiwan. At the same time, though, the US does not recognize formally that Taiwan is independent of China either. So it's this delicate truce about Taiwan's status that's been very stable in recent decades. So what's been concerning recently is that as China's military power has grown, as it's done dramatically in recent decades, China's leaders have been pretty vocal that they intend reunification sooner rather than later. So here on the slide, I have some quotes or events that have happened in recent years. So in 2024, Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly told the Chinese armed forces to be ready for war by 2027. Not saying that war would occur then, but that he wanted the Chinese military to be equipped for war by that point. He often makes speeches along the lines of one in December 2024, where he said, "No one can stop the historical trend of national reunification." And then just last month, China established a new national holiday called Taiwan Restoration Day, which marks the day in 1945 when Taiwan was restored to China from its Japanese occupiers. So in other words, Xi Jinping is increasingly staking his public domestic political reputation on the issue of reunifying Taiwan, which, as I mentioned earlier, is just extremely sensitive to ordinary Chinese people and can really stoke this nationalist sentiment. So then the question is, well, how might China try to achieve that reunification, and what circumstances could lead to escalation and actual war, and then, as we'll discuss later, potentially even nuclear war? So there are basically two families of strategies that China could use. The first is a traditional military invasion. And the good news in terms of escalation is that China seems to understand that a successful invasion would be extremely difficult and extremely risky. It's incredibly hard to bring military equipment and personnel the 100 miles of ocean between mainland China and Taiwan. Taiwan has also built very strong defenses, and the US gives significant military support to Taiwan, as it has for a long time. China attacking Taiwan could also hurt itself economically because China is very dependent on Taiwanese technology imports, which could be jeopardized. So I think that experts agree that China seems unlikely to invade militarily under the current status quo. Now, the exception might be if Taiwan declared formal independence, which is a clear red line for Beijing, or if the US recognized Taiwan's independence. But currently, China seems to understand that military invasion is so risky that it's just not worth it. And so that, of course, lowers the risk not just of conventional war, but also of nuclear war. So instead, what China has been doing is something called gray zone tactics, to try to coerce Taiwan essentially into giving up any kind of de facto independence and accepting Chinese control. And so gray zone tactics are coercive moves that fall between peace on the one hand and open war on the other hand. So some examples are China's running warplane and warship patrols around Taiwan almost every day, or imposing sudden trade bans on important Taiwanese exports that the Taiwanese economy depends on, trying to isolate Taiwan internationally through various methods. These are designed to wear away at Taiwan's resolve slowly over time, basically to get Taiwan to capitulate. The gray zone tactics can also include newer tools like disinformation or deepfake videos that are actually aimed at ordinary Taiwanese people to affect their faith in the Taiwanese government, their faith in the US commitment to Taiwan, things like that. And China has also recently passed extremely harsh anti-independence laws that threaten activists in Taiwan with long prison terms or even the death penalty. And so these are all meant to essentially scare Taiwan slowly into political concessions. So on the one hand, this is obviously extremely difficult for the Taiwanese people, but on the other hand, these kinds of tactics tend to be less likely to escalate into open war. And so that reduces not just the risk of conventional military escalation, but also, again, of nuclear escalation. So I've given you some reasons to maybe not feel as concerned about war or nuclear war as you might be, but the risk is still not zero. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But what I'll do first is talk just a bit about what the US ought to be doing. So, what should the US be doing if we want to keep the risk of war and nuclear escalation low, but still outcompete China? Because China is very clearly the US's main international competitor right now, and we have very different interests. So, the first step is that we have to keep deterrence strong around Taiwan and do it in a calm and thoughtful way that communicates to China that an invasion is going to be incredibly costly. And so that means having steady and predictable military aid to Taiwan so that it can keep its own defenses strong. It means U.S. military presence in the region to signal that the U.S. commitment is real, despite maybe some ambiguous statements because of the sort of delicate truce that I was talking about earlier. It also means tight cooperation with allies like Japan and others, including joint exercises so everyone can see the capabilities that we have. And also very clear that if Beijing steps up that gray zone pressure that I was talking about, that there will be serious consequences like trade measures and limits on access to technology. So that's the first pillar. The second is that we have to build on America's structural advantages, of which it has many, and use them really carefully. So, in terms of economic tools, using really restrained, targeted trade sanctions instead of big tariffs that also hurt countries, like our allies or Taiwan. It also means investing in scientific research via universities, investing in manufacturing and building clean energy so we can keep up with the AI boom, a big area of competition between the US and China. It means protecting the dominance of the US dollar, which gives us huge advantages economically that affect Americans at home, and also the independence of the Federal Reserve. And importantly, it means treating our allies very carefully and not picking fights with them. So the big picture is that we have these carrots and sticks that we can use, but you have to be extremely careful, use them in a sort of long-term way and not for short-term political advantage, which leaders are naturally tempted to do. And so the issue here is that the strategy is actually pretty complicated. So doing what I just said effectively, it requires immense expertise among the staff advising any US president. It requires immense discipline and restraint and taking the long view. And so that takes me to my final point, which is that domestic politics in each country actually make it very difficult to pull off this delicate balance of avoiding escalation while still remaining competitive. That could instead result in escalation. So let's start with China. So under President Xi Jinping, China has increasingly become what we call a personalist authoritarian regime. So a personalist regime is one where political power is highly concentrated in one leader. So access to power flows through the leader, and other government officials don't have their own power bases to fall back on, but they're serving at the leader's pleasure. If the leader goes, they go. The leader decides they don't like them anymore, they're out. And so in this kind of system, there are very few incentives for experts and advisors to challenge the leader if they make an erratic or ill-advised decision. And the reason is that could spell the end of their political career. And so research, including my own research, has shown that these personalistic regimes are the kinds of regime that are most likely to initiate wars, that they often do so even when there's not a clear plan for victory. We just saw this a few years ago with Putin of Russia, another personalist dictator, invading Ukraine with seemingly without the kinds of consultation you would think he would have wanted to undertake before invading, without a really clear plan for how that was going to go. Personalist regimes in general are just much more likely to calculate and make erratic decisions that can lead to inadvertent escalation. And so with China's current governing structure, this is an increasing concern. The problem, though, is that this isn't just on the Chinese side, it's also on the US side, in that there's an increasing level of personalism in the US. So in the first Trump administration, Trump appointed a lot of experienced advisors who would occasionally actually stand up to him when they didn't agree. So people talk about how there were strong guardrails on Trump in the first administration, just like there are on any U.S. president. Um, they typically see the expertise of those around them as a real asset. In Trump's second term, though, he has just not invited those kinds of people into his orbit. So the advisors in his current administration, he seems to have chosen them more for reasons of loyalty, people that he knows will stick by him no matter what, rather than their experience and their competence. And if you just look at the bios of some of the officials, you see this. And what's even worse is that Trump has actually started a retribution campaign against people who agreed with him and who disagreed with him in the past. For example, the recent indictment of John Bolton, a member of his first cabinet. So the people around Trump advising him, but also everyone in Congress, everyone in the bureaucracy, and everyone in the judiciary knows that if they cross Trump, if they criticize him, they have a lot to lose. They'll basically have a target painted on their back. And this is a hallmark personalist dictatorship move, and this is exactly the kind of dynamic that can lead to this miscalculation and lack of restraint that I've studied in personalist dictatorships. So even though the US is a democracy sort of, at a broad-based level, the politics at the top are extremely worrisome. And I think we already see some of the consequences of this in foreign policy. So consider tariff policy, right? So it's absolutely right that using tariffs to put pressure on China is a good idea, but you have to do so very carefully and in a restrained way. And that's not what we're seeing right now, right? So instead, we're seeing tariffs that one could argue seem like they're more designed for short-term political gain, like raising revenues to offset tax cuts. And when that's your goal, then maybe you're going to start to do things like tariff our friends and not just our competitors. And so this kind of approach, I think, not only doesn't help us win the strategic competition, but it can actually lead to these greater risks of escalation, right? So if Trump got it into his head that it's time to escalate, but everyone around him is afraid, right? Who's going to talk him out of it? So that is a plot twist that was not part of the Netflix movie House of Dynamite, which is an interesting watch, by the way. So this is all just going to become more and more important in the coming years as China's military capacity continues to build, right? It's putting enormous investments into its blue water navy. It's increasingly building the capacity to project military power to other parts of the world. Experts think that the Persian Gulf will eventually be a big flashpoint. So there's just going to be additional areas of potential escalation. We're not quite there yet, but it's coming. So hopefully that gives us a starting point for thinking about the sort of broader escalation risks. And then there's lots more to talk about. So thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. We will come back to you with questions, but first, Sébastien Philippe is next. And Sébastien, as noted in the intro, is someone who studies nuclear security and received a MacArthur grant for his work, which is also called a Genius Grant. I realize expertise has fallen out of favor in some circles in America, but we love it at the University of Wisconsin. So, Sébastien, it is great to have you on the show, and congratulations, by the way, on that award. It's very rare, and we are really excited to hear what you have to say about nuclear weapons risks and monitoring and the like, which I know you study. And maybe you can share a bit with our audience about the sort of things that you study in your work.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for having me today, and thank you for this kind acknowledgement. So I am new to the university. I arrived this past August, and unlike all my colleagues in my department who focus on the civilian application of nuclear energy in developing the next generation of nuclear reactor and fusion reactors, I studied nuclear security. I try to understand the consequences of nuclear weapon use and nuclear war, so as to better inform US domestic policy, but also international diplomacy on those issues. And on the technical side, my group focused on developing technologies to detect, monitor, and verify nuclear activities worldwide. But today I won't be talking about this. Today I will be talking about the U.S.-China nuclear rivalry and whether or not we are maybe entering a new arms race. So I'll use my few minutes tonight to bring some clarity to this complex moment in U.S.-China relations, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. Just a few weeks ago, President Trump and President Xi held a rare meeting. Shortly before the meeting started, President Trump suggested that the United States might need to resume nuclear explosive testing, something we haven't done since 1992. So that raised the important question, why no, and how would China respond, and what does this mean for global security more broadly? So one thing that is clear, starting with basic facts, is China has been expanding its nuclear forces, especially in the past few years. For decades, it had kept a relatively small nuclear arsenal, just enough to be able to retaliate if attacked. But in recent years, Beijing is beginning to field new missiles, submarines, and controls and command system. What's important to understand is that China is not trying to match the United States weapon for weapon. It is trying to make sure its deterrents survive in a world where both the US and Russia still have much larger and more sophisticated arsenals. One striking example here you can see on this map is the construction of over 300 new missile silos in Western China. Satellite imagery confirms these sites, but we don't actually know how many will contain real missiles yet. China may only load a fraction of them or may load all of them in the future. The point, I think, right now is to create uncertainty, to force an adversary, here the US, to assume the worst, and also complicating any idea that China's forces could be neutralized in a single first strike. It's also crucial to see this Chinese buildup in a larger context. Every nuclear-armed country in the world today is modernizing its nuclear arsenal. There are 9 countries having nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia still possess roughly 90% of the total the world stockpiles, which currently is at around 12,000 nuclear weapons. Not all of those nuclear weapons are ready to be used at any moment. This number is closer to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 or so. In that range, there are many weapons that are waiting to be dismantled, but we are at a time where most arsenals and weapon systems that were developed at the end of the Cold War and then deployed throughout the 90s and 2000s and 2010s are now being replaced. And here it's important to see that from Beijing's perspective, they still see 2 nuclear superpowers that are improving their forces and investing heavily in new capabilities. In the US, we're going to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize our entire nuclear forces. But that doesn't necessarily justify what China is doing, but it is one of the things that explains the drivers. Is one of the drivers here that explain this move. Another one is also very important, and I want to flag it here, is that under President Trump, the US recently announced plans to vastly expand its missile defense capabilities. And here's a quote from President Trump saying that once fully constructed, the Golden Dome will be capable of intercepting missiles, even if they are launched from other sides of the world, and even if they're launched from space. And we will have the best system ever built. So when he talks about building a Golden Dome, that sends a very strong signal to Chinese nuclear planners. Chinese nuclear planners were already afraid of the possibility during escalation of a disarming first strike against their nuclear forces. So any Chinese weapons that could survive this first strike could then be stopped or absorbed by such large and possibly capable ballistic missile defense systems. So if China here believes the US might someday be able to defend against retaliatory strikes, then it feels compelled to build more missiles and more sophisticated ones. So the cycle here isn't just about competition, it's also about perceptions and the fear of being vulnerable. So at the same time, it's important to note that the US-Russia nuclear relationship also hasn't been doing very well. And the global arms control framework that we inherited from the Cold War is now completely crumbling. The last treaty limiting US and Russian deployed nuclear weapons at around 1,500 each is set to expire next February. The day after my birthday. I always remember it like this. If it's not extended or replaced for the first time since the 70s, there will be no limits at all on the two largest arsenals in the world. And that vacuum could make China even more worried, but it also, in a world where there would be no rules, kind of push every sides to prepare for worst case scenarios. And that includes the US, Russia, and China here in this context. And so in that broad crumbling of arms control and push to modernize nuclear weapon systems, we're now having the American president demanding the resumption of US nuclear weapon testing, something that the US hasn't done since 1992. Public statements about testing like other countries do signal here a shift in tone. If the US were to resume testing, China would likely follow immediately. And we've had reporting recently that their test site may be ready to test nuclear weapons. They've been doing a lot of work on their facilities, but the same is true in Russia, and the same is true to some extent also in the United States. But here, China has far more to gain from new testing that the US does, because its warhead designs are less mature, and because the United States' nuclear arsenal and knowledge about nuclear weapons benefits from over 1,000 nuclear tests that the country has done in the past. Today's nuclear weapons in the country are small, light, and destructive. One of them can destroy an entire city. For example, here is the detonation of a 200 kiloton weapon over New York that would completely incinerate the city. That weapon today weighs about maybe 200 to 300 pounds. So it's very, very light types of nuclear weapons that the US spent billions of dollars trying to develop and refine. Those weapons are also extremely precise, and they allow you to target not just large targets, but also very pinpoint, bunkers or military facilities and so on. And today, with current arsenals and the number of weapons deployed, we already have systems that are capable of vastly degrading US adversaries, but also at the same time could lead to immense number of casualties in a nuclear war. With studies, recent ones have shown that any large-scale exchange that could result from escalations between major powers could produce over 90 million immediate casualties. The long-term consequences may be even worse. Collapse of critical infrastructures, food systems, global supply chains, and potentially long-lasting climate impacts. And I was lucky this past summer to be appointed by the UN Secretary General on a new panel to study the consequences of nuclear war. So this is the first study at the United Nations on this topic in 40 years, and we're set to produce a report in 2 years. But already before even getting too deep into this report, we can see that, and we know all of us, that nuclear weapons are unlike any other form of military and power competition. But while nuclear weapons have not been used, thankfully, in war since 1945 and the nuclear bombings in Japan, More than 2,000 tests have occurred worldwide since then, and millions of people have been exposed to fallout. And we're still learning today about the long-term health effect and environmental consequences. In the US alone, it took nearly 80 years for residents of New Mexico that were affected by the July 1945 Trinity test to be included in federal compensation. This happened only this year, after a long public policy campaign on trying to recognize, the impact of U.S. nuclear testing on this community. As for the Nevada test site where most U.S. tests occur, I wanted to share an image here. This is not the surface of the moon. This is what the test site looks like. Those tests occur on traditional lands of the Western Shoshone Nation. And of course, the landscape has been changed forever. And so this is part of why the US should be also extremely cautious before discussing a return to testing. The consequences here are not only, of national security importance, but they're also environmental, political, and moral, and those consequences would be profound. Perhaps one additional point I want to stress here is that since 1992, the US has spent billions of dollars developing technologies to maintain a safe and secure nuclear arsenal without the need to test. Every year, the directors of the US nuclear weapon laboratories write a letter to the president certifying that the stockpile is ready to be used if need be, that it is secure and that it is safe to use, and that at this point still there is no technical need to resume testing. So with that, I want you to, take away a few important points. The last major nuclear arms control treaty between the US and Russia is expiring very soon. So we will be in a world where there will be no restriction on the size of nuclear arsenals. And given current competitions between US, China, and Russia, we have a recipe for arms racing. But that being said, the US has enough nuclear weapons to deter both countries and does not need to engage at this point in any buildup of arms racing. Should the US decide to restart testing, China would certainly follow suit, benefiting the most. And in my opinion, it would be a grave mistake for the United States to do so. And while this and those conversations are happening, I think it's very fundamental for the public to re-engage with nuclear weapons policies. And because we need to understand that this is not an inevitable future, that this is about policy choices, and that we all have a role to play here to get in a world where this type of action may not need to restart at this point. So thanks.
Sébastien, thank you for sharing your knowledge of that state of affairs as it relates to nuclear weapons and the risks. And we are going to go now to some audience questions. But before we jump to those, I have a question for Jessica. And it's really along the following lines. The US and Chinese policy toward Taiwan, it seems like kind of a charade. It's like we're not really being honest here. Nobody really knows where the lines are. And why wouldn't we try to have a real conversation about our respective interests and figure out, is there some way that China can satisfy its security needs? We can somehow share the benefit of the Taiwan economy, which is critical to both of us. And the people of Taiwan can kind of have options for, like where they want to live and how they want to live. What's stopping us from having something that's more transparent and rational? Because what we have now, it just seems like bullshit.
Yes, it's always interesting to teach students about, because ambiguity and the sort of double speak. It's often about the choice of word. Is it acknowledge versus recognize? Is it the one China policy or the one China principle? And these all have these extremely nuanced differences, different translations. So you're absolutely right that there's a lot of like wordsmithing and doublespeak around this. I think the really important thing that I don't think Americans can wrap their head around is how sensitive the Taiwan issue is for Chinese people today. And that is in part a political choice, I think, by the Chinese government, as I understand it, to keep that fire burning. But the fact is that they have made that political choice for generations now. And sometimes you talk to Chinese people about this. This has been the case with students coming to UW sometimes, and the issue of Taiwan comes up and they get upset because this is so core to national identity. And I've tried to think of what's a thought experiment that would really convey to Americans how the emotions around this issue that create the context for the conversations to have to be so careful. And I'll come back to your bigger question in a moment. It's like, imagine that a US state, imagine that Florida like floated off into the ocean and then seceded and then was cozied up to a hostile foreign power. And imagine that this happened after what felt like a humiliating century of invasion and colonialism and all of these things. And then imagine that I'm not justifying it, but I'm just trying to explain what I think the mindset is from the Chinese side, so to make sense of this. Then imagine that your country underwent a massive economic transformation and became a global power, a great power that is starting to rival the United States. And then you have this like thorn in your side right off your coast, right in what for other countries are their sphere of influence. I mean, think about how the US has acted in the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, this is, and politics today, right? The US does not tolerate this kind of presence in its hemisphere, but China's being asked to. And I haven't even mentioned the cultural ties. I mean, there are real cultural and family ties. That is true. This is only a few generations old that this separation occurred. And so I think you have to understand that there are genuine underlying emotions on the part of many people in China, certainly ordinary Chinese people that have been taught since they were very young to think about Taiwan in this way. Like they really use terms like sacred land to describe Taiwan. And so what that means is that there's just any kind of honest talk about the status of Taiwan runs the risk of inflaming these nationalist tensions. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government is keeping that flame alive. And so it is a political choice on the part of China, and I think a strategic one that gives it more bargaining leverage because it puts other countries back on their heels. But I think that's part of the reason. I think the U.S. would be very happy to have these conversations, and I haven't been in the room, but I suspect that they try to talk, about these issues. But I think it's a non-starter until something really changes culturally. I actually don't think it's very much about the geostrategic questions as much as this identity-based source.
Oh, interesting, because I would hope that outside of the public view, I realize both sides have to have, certain positions for their citizens, but I would hope outside of the public view, like the conversations are a bit more real and we, understand our respective interests. And, it's too bad we couldn't just move Taiwan to Cuba and, vice versa.
But what if that were to leak, right? What if the Chinese government said things? Right.
I suppose. I guess Xi could deny it because he's all powerful. But yeah, I mean, in your opinion, does China have a legitimate claim to Taiwan, going back to 1947? So what is your thought about that?
Oh gosh, this is like now
Okay, we'll
am I
pass.
gonna have
We'll
armies
pass.
of? Can I
You,
pass
you,
on
you, you
that?
hang on. I'll ask Sebastian a question because I know he has a bomb shelter in his house because he just bought a new house. He didn't build it, he inherited it. However, is there anything like, people in this country should be doing to be prepared for some kind of nuclear escalation?
There is nothing you can do, to prepare yourself. I think should anything remotely what I spoke about happen, it's the idea of, even if I have fallout shelter in my basement, I don't intend to ride the nuclear war in it. I prefer to spend my energy before nuclear war happens to make it less likely to happen, than to get to that point. But this is a tough question, and this is something that, in some sense, um, could still be interesting to re-engage the public about those issues, because back in the 1950s, what it took for a family to build the bomb shelter in their basement, probably they were incredibly, scared away about the prospect of the possibility of having those weapons being used. And when you think more about it, you realize that this happened at a time where, well, there is no treaties limiting the number of nuclear weapons. There was nothing preventing the arms race going forward, and this is exactly where we're going back. So
Mm,
maybe we need to be scared a little bit. So we get to act
yeah,
more.
fair, fair. You had mentioned just on the basis of the number of weapons we have, we shouldn't really be concerned. The Chinese and Russians should feel like we have a deterrent, but they're also trying to advance their own technology in a variety of ways. And do you worry at all that, if we don't continue to push forward with more advanced technologies, that they could develop things that could evade any of our defenses and they could develop defenses that we couldn't penetrate? Is that possible if we were too lax?
I don't think so, and here I want to make the point. I mean, first of all, the U.S. defenses are not great at this point. You should not rely on this if you want to fight the nuclear war at all. And the plans that have been put forward with this administration are, to say the least, probably science fiction at this point. I mean, we don't know how much it would cost to build a complete, like the type of like space-based interceptors, Star Wars, President Reagan type of plans. It was too expensive the first time, and it's probably going to be too expensive this time around. So on the being afraid of others developing weapon systems, new weapon systems, what we've seen really recently is the Russians developing exotic nuclear weapon systems, which I think are, goal or purpose is twofold. One is to communicate to the United States their profound opposition to the buildup of missile defense system infrastructure, and two, to kind of try to scare people by developing weapons of dooms, and with incredible claims of technical capabilities, which at the end of the day are pretty useless, because if nuclear war is to happen, it's going to be with the hundreds of nuclear weapons that are already deployed, and those are in nuclear missile silos in the continental US. They are on submarines at sea. ready to be launched, and they can fly within minutes to their targets, and they will destroy their targets. So that infrastructure in this country exists. It is very robust. The military every day trains to, possibly use nuclear weapons in war. And so there is no, if there were a competition, the US would win it every day. That's my perspective. It's certainly not a competition that should be, pursued recklessly at all. But we shouldn't think about this as a competition. I think
And you think that's common knowledge among our rivals?
They know, yes, they know. I mean, China has much fewer weapons than the United States, are much less advanced. And even though we say, oh, they're building more advanced, they're still not, reaching the capability of the U.S. Army on many fronts. But this may not be true on the conventional weapons side, even though the U.S. military is still far superior to the Chinese military. And the Chinese military also isn't really tested, right? So battle tested. Look at Russia and Ukraine. You have one of the largest military in the world, nuclear armed to the teeth, and they can't manage to really breach the Ukrainian defense. So this is a lesson for all of us. The nuclear weapons are not going to solve all our problems. They may create more, and ones we can't, that will be very complicated to deal with if the weapons are used. But it's not, if there are areas to compete between one another, that's not the space where we should invest our money.
We have a guest question. Is it really in Russia's best interest at present to invest large amounts of money in a nuclear arsenal that would probably go unused while they're struggling in Ukraine?
I think the answer to that, Jessica, if I can, take that question, is simply that no. And Russia is, seeing multiple. I mean, it has to keep high military investments to fight its war in Ukraine. At the same time, want to remodernize its nuclear weapons system, which is also expensive. And perhaps that is going to slow down in some sense. And this is why perhaps we see more on TV the kind of exotic tests that, rattle everybody, but they are not fundamentally, structurally changing anything. So perhaps we will see more of that communication, communication, I don't know, strategies from the Russian states to try to tell us that they're doing something radically new, but in reality, perhaps they are, slowing things down so they can continue to do, what is very critical to them, which is possibly winning this war in Ukraine. Yeah.
That's okay. Any thoughts on that?
And I think it doesn't seem like a very good use of Russian capacities right now, given its challenges that it's already having.
Yeah. Paul Wirch asks, how confident are we in the older nuclear warheads that we have? And do these older warheads pose some kind of risk to us?
This is a great question. So the warheads, maybe some of the components may be old, but the key components of nuclear weapons, like the fissile materials, like plutonium, age very slowly, very, very slowly. And so far we don't see any, there is no chance that they will stop working tomorrow. The US has decided to restart this small scale production of nuclear weapons pits, so those plutonium parts. It's a program that is having its own trouble. But so far as we know, the weapons are working, and all the components of all our nuclear weapon systems can be tested, even if you don't do a live full explosive yield nuclear test. Everything can be tested, and everything is tested all the time. So I don't really have any concern that they would not work at this point.
We have an audience question. Why does China not hold the same feelings for northern Manchuria, I assume, as they do for Taiwan? Is it just more convenient in a real politics sense to be mad at the US and not Russia? Because northern Manchuria has been kind of a disputed territory between Russia and China. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the, I don't know the history as well to know sort of what kind of narrative could have been spread about Manchuria in the way that it has with Taiwan. I think that China's interests, I think part of what feels like such a thumb in the eye is the fact that Taiwan has this alignment with the West, which has, especially in recent years, felt much less has much less aligned interests with China than Russia has. I think the sea access. I mean, I sort of said glibly that the national security component isn't important today. It isn't the driving force, that it's more this ideological narrative. But that may not have been true in the past. And Manchuria is not strategically important in the same way that Taiwan has been. And in past decades, arguably, it did matter more that the U.S. had a presence, would have that sort of link in the first island chain. So my guess is that it's sort of a combination of the building of the narrative, and that narrative taking hold during that particular strategic moment. But I think it's a great question. I'd want to know more about the raw material of the story underlying, the claims.
It doesn't seem that Manchuria could be as strategically important. I mean, they don't have Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. I mean,
but that's newer. So the question is, like, why didn't that story emerge 50 years ago, 70 years ago in the same way?
Fair.
Yeah.
Okay. Thomas Garrow asks, we've kind of focused entirely on Russia and China, mostly US, China, but what about players like North Korea or Pakistan and India? How does, a resumption of testing by the US or, just this more open possible escalation and growth in nuclear arsenals, how does it affect those other players? I guess Israel would be part of this, Iran potentially. How are they affected?
I mean, look, I think every country that has been waiting for the opportunity to restart testing as soon as the US does it, and if China follow through, they will test nuclear weapons. I have no doubt about that. And the countries you mentioned, I mean, especially India and Pakistan, could definitely benefit from further nuclear testing. North Korea is a little bit more complicated because it has continued, nuclear testing. As we know, it's the country who was tested the most recently, just a few years ago. And right now, they're limited in their ability to grow their nuclear arsenal by the amount of fissile materials that they can produce. But I think all of those countries are likely to be and go on an upward trajectory if that is the norm, and that becomes the norms to establish yourself as part of the serious nuclear club, building new nuclear weapons. I'm pretty sure we'll see that happening. Yeah.
Jessica, do you have thoughts about where the area of greatest risk is in the world today as relates to some kind of nuclear, I'll call it a mistake? Somebody launches a nuclear weapon.
I think at this point it would probably be based on a intelligence error. I think where, I mean, not to draw too much inspiration from the movies, but I actually think that the Netflix movie that I was referring to does portray sort of one of the more realistic scenarios for a nuclear exchange, where because I think there's a very strong norm of no first use. I don't see that changing anytime soon. So nuclear weapons are really, I think, a more likely, I think, to keep deterrence credible, it's more likely that a country would use nuclear weapons when it felt that a strike was incoming on it. And so that would be most likely to occur in some kind of accident scenario where there's an incorrect inference about a strike occurring or imminent. So I don't see right now, I don't see a situation in which that's particularly likely. I don't see a conventional war escalating to, the other pathway would be within the context of a conventional war where one country affirmatively makes the decision to use nuclear weapons first. And I don't see a very clear scenario in which that's likely to happen. So again, I think it's really coming through a miscalculation channel. But I'm curious what Sébastien thinks about this. I'm coming that from the sort of strategic international relations perspective and maybe not other pathways.
I mean, I think, if the case, the most recent interesting case, I think that comes to mind is, 2022, December 2022, November 2022, when the Russian army front line was collapsing, and there was the fear that some large portion of their army were going to collapse completely or be captured or get killed. And there were reports from U.S. intelligence agencies that the Russians, were preparing maybe 50% chance of using a nuclear weapons just to shock the Ukrainians to stop that advance, something like that. So I think there are kind of scenarios in which those weapons could be used in the first time. In those kind of my conventional war is not going as planned and things are collapsing, and my field general is calling and saying, I need something, otherwise we're all gonna die. Type of scenarios. I think that probably could happen, and I could see, I don't see this happening right now in Ukraine, because although we know the Russian army is moving forward, the front is still relatively stable. But I think, going back to Europe right now with Russia, there is a real fear of in some of the northern European states, for example, that a war could come eventually, or they could be tested. The European conventional forces capabilities are not what they used to be, and were not that great in the first place. And I think they would be called for using nuclear weapons even within NATO if something similar to what's happening in Ukraine were to happen, in the Baltic states, for example. So I there may be kind of flashpoints and pressure points to kind of start first, but usually you would probably not start first on a very large scale.
Yeah.
Although, then, can you control escalation? Yes or no? We don't, it's not something I'm ready to bet my.
Yeah. I guess, okay, so I take your point as being about, I know we're running out of time here, but to be about sort of like a desperate move. Putin thinks he's literally about to lose the war, die. I guess the question still is, why go nuclear when we have conventional weapons that can deliver a lot of firepower? So would it really be necessary to cross the nuclear threshold? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question, and hopefully not.
Can we end on that note?
Yeah,
Hopefully not.
the one, I mean, let's have war without nuclear weapons. I don't know if it's the most helpful note, but yes, let's definitely not use them. Yeah.
Well, it would be nice if we didn't have to have war at all, but so far we've struggled with that as a world. But I want to thank you both for taking time tonight. We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to cut everybody loose here. But Jessica, thanks for coming back and joining us. Sebastian, thanks for being here with us tonight and sharing your expertise as well. And we've had a lively audience, great questions, a lot of back and forth. Really appreciate all of you tuning in and giving us your thoughts and observations as well. So we will be back in December, most likely with our traditional Predictions 2026 program. And I hope you'll be here to join us. And in the meantime, on Wisconsin.